Picture this: a cobbled street in a medieval town, eerily quiet except for the distant coughs of the sick. The air is thick with the scent of herbs and decay. And there, standing side by side, are two figures who couldn't seem more different. The plague doctor, clad in his ominous beak-like mask, and the court jester, decked in motley colors, bells jingling with every step. One represents fear, the other laughter. One carries the weight of death, the other the promise of distraction. Yet in this moment, amid the chaos of a world crumbling under disease, their roles intertwine in ways no one could have predicted. This is the untold story of how two symbols of medieval life, the healer and the fool, became unlikely mirrors of each other during humanity's darkest hours. What does it say about us that in the face of catastrophe, societies turn to both science and silliness? The plague doctor, with his mysterious remedies and solemn presence, offered a fragile hope, a belief that death could be held at bay. Meanwhile, the jester danced through the despair, his jokes and antics a temporary escape from the terror outside. On the surface, they seem like opposites. But dig deeper and you'll find a shared purpose: to mend what was broken, whether through medicine or mirth. One fought the sickness of the body, the other the sickness of the soul. And in that struggle, they revealed something profound about how people cope when the world feels like it's ending. This is a tale of resilience, of the strange and surprising ways humans adapt when disaster strikes. Over the course of this video, we'll unravel the parallel lives of these two figures, how they rose to prominence in times of crisis, how their roles evolved, and what their stories tell us about the enduring spirit of communities under siege. From the crowded courts of kings to the plague-ridden streets of ordinary towns, we'll explore how laughter and healing became two sides of the same coin. So settle in, because what unfolds is more than just history. It's a reflection of the timeless ways we confront fear, find hope, and stubbornly cling to life even when death seems inevitable. The plague doctor emerged from one of history's most desperate chapters, the Black Death that swept through Europe in the mid-1400s. As entire towns succumbed to the mysterious illness, people clung to any semblance of protection. Enter these enigmatic figures, dressed head to toe in waxed coats, their faces hidden behind grotesque beaked masks stuffed with aromatic herbs like lavender and cloves. At a time when medical knowledge was limited, their bizarre appearance wasn't just practical, it was psychological armor. The long beak, designed to keep bad air at bay, turned healers into something almost supernatural. They moved through plague-stricken streets like shadows, their presence a grim reminder of death's proximity, yet their very existence offered a fragile thread of hope. But here's the twist: many of these so-called doctors had no formal training. Some were second-rate physicians, others merely volunteers or even con artists capitalizing on panic. Their treatments, from bloodletting to applying live frogs to buboes, often did more harm than good. Yet in the public imagination, they became something larger than life. The plague doctor's costume, now an iconic symbol of medieval medicine, was as much about theater as science. The dramatic robes and mask weren't just protective gear, they transformed ordinary men into figures of authority, a visual promise that someone, however ill-equipped, was fighting back against the invisible enemy. This duality, healer and harbinger, savior and omen, mirrored society's fractured psyche during epidemics. Just as people vacillated between hope and despair, the plague doctor embodied both. And in that tension, we see the first echoes of an unexpected parallel. Because while these masked figures navigated the physical devastation of plague, another character was working to mend spirits in the same crumbling world. The court jester, whose role in crisis would prove just as vital and just as complicated. While the plague doctor moved through the streets like a silent specter, the court jester bounded into rooms with a riot of color and sound, bells jingling, shoes slapping against stone floors, his voice cutting through the heaviness of fear with razor-sharp wit. Where the doctor's presence whispered of mortality, the jester's laughter defied it. But don't mistake his motley attire and pranks for mere frivolity. In an era when plagues and wars could erase whole communities overnight, the jester's role transformed from simple entertainer to something far more vital, a lifeline for frayed nerves and broken spirits. Kings and commoners alike clung to humor as a survival tactic. It's no accident that jesters flourished during Europe's most turbulent centuries. Their comedy wasn't just distraction, it was rebellion. Behind the exaggerated grimaces and bawdy songs lay a razor's edge of truth. They enjoyed the rare privilege of mocking nobility without punishment, using satire to voice what others couldn't. When famine followed pestilence, a jester might joke about the bishop's well-fed belly. When rulers bungled wars, their follies became punchlines. In a world where speaking against authority could mean death, the fool's cap was both costume and shield, allowing society to confront its anxieties through laughter rather than despair. The contrast between jester and plague doctor couldn't be more visual, one swathed in dark, ominous robes, the other a riot of mismatched fabrics and jangling bells. Yet both outfits were carefully crafted symbols. The doctor's mask projected authority, the jester's motley exposed the absurdity of hierarchies. One enforced order, the other subverted it. But here's the fascinating parallel. Both served as release valves for collective terror. Where medicine failed to cure the body, humor offered a salve for the mind. Towns might quarantine the sick, but they welcomed jesters into their squares, desperate for the catharsis of shared laughter. Perhaps that's why jesters often accompanied armies into battle or appeared in plague-stricken towns, not despite the suffering, but because of it. Their antics weren't denial, they were defiance. A jester turning death into a punchline wasn't disrespecting the dying. He was reminding the living that joy could still exist, even here, even now. And in that stubborn refusal to surrender to darkness, these two figures, one cloaked in dread, the other in delirium, became unexpected allies in humanity's oldest fight, the battle to keep hope alive when the world feels hopeless. During the worst years of the Black Death, when entire villages vanished and survivors barricaded themselves indoors, something remarkable happened in the shadows of despair. The plague doctor and the court jester, polar opposites in appearance and method, found their purposes converging in unexpected ways. Consider the records from Avignon in 1348, where a physician named Raymond Chalon would make his rounds in a waxed cloak, poultices clinking in his satchel, while in the very same streets, a jester named Thomas the Toothless, so called for his trademark gap-toothed grin, performed puppet shows from an overturned cart. One man carried the bitter scent of vinegar and herbs, the other left trails of laughter in his wake, yet both were desperately needed fixtures of a society teetering on collapse. Medicine, for all its limitations, gave people something tangible to believe in. When a plague doctor pressed a leech to a patient's arm or burned aromatic resins to purify the air, it was a ritual as much as a treatment, a visible act of defiance against an unseen killer. Meanwhile, in castles where nobility huddled behind tapestries, jesters performed a different kind of alchemy. Take the account of King Casimir of Poland's court, where the royal fool, Boruta, famously balanced a loaf of bread on his nose during a summer dinner, declaring it the only thing in the kingdom not infected with gloom. The outburst earned shocked silence, then uproarious laughter that, according to chroniclers, lifted the court's spirits for weeks. these weren't just distractions, they were psychological lifelines. The deeper connection lies in how both roles exploited spectacle to manipulate emotion. A plague doctor's eerie costume wasn't just protective, it turned medicine into theater, transforming fear into awe. Similarly, a jester's exaggerated pratfalls and bawdy songs reframed tragedy as farce, letting audiences briefly escape their terror. In Milan, records describe a masked doctor parading through the square with a bell, urging crowds to burn their contaminated clothes, while a troupe of performers staged a mock trial of King Plague, complete with a papier-mâché effigy set ablaze. The message was the same: we name the monster and thus we begin to tame it. So were they two sides of the same coin? Absolutely. One treated the body's sickness, the other treated the soul's. And in their shared understanding of human nature, they revealed a timeless truth. Survival isn't just about dodging death, it's about remembering how to live. The doctor's herbs might fail, the jester's jokes might ring hollow, but together they offered something no single remedy could: the fragile, necessary illusion of control in a world gone mad. This symbiosis becomes even clearer when we examine how their legacies intertwined after the plagues faded. The same societies that memorialized plague doctors in woodcuts and cautionary tales also elevated jesters to mythic status. Both became symbols of resistance, one against disease, the other against despair. And perhaps that's why, centuries later, we still find ourselves drawn to their stories. They remind us that in the face of the unimaginable, humanity's greatest tools have never been just medicine or might, but the twin sparks of hope and humor, striking flint against the darkness. The plague doctor's medicine bag held an eerie collection of tools that blurred the line between science and superstition. Among the most infamous was the bloodletting knife, used to balance the humors, a practice dating back to ancient Greece, where illness was thought to stem from an imbalance of bodily fluids. Patients might lose pints of blood, weakening them further, yet this brutal method persisted for centuries as physicians clung to tradition. Equally unsettling were the leeches, applied to swollen buboes in a futile attempt to draw out bad blood. But not all their methods were so grim. Their beaked masks stuffed with posies of lavender, mint, or cloves reflected a crude understanding of contagion theory, the belief that fragrant herbs could ward off miasma, the foul air thought to spread disease. Some remedies bordered on the surreal. Records from Venice describe doctors rubbing patients with mercury or powdered emeralds, while others prescribed viper wine, a concoction of snake flesh steeped in alcohol. Yet for all their bizarre methods, plague doctors inadvertently pioneered early public health measures. They advocated for quarantines, burned contaminated bedding, and even promoted basic hygiene like washing hands with vinegar. Though their science was flawed, their systematic approach laid groundwork for modern epidemiology. Now consider the Jester's toolkit no less unconventional, but designed to heal minds rather than bodies. Where plague doctors wielded lancets, Jesters brandished wit like a scalpel, cutting through despair with carefully crafted jokes. Their prescriptions included satirical songs mocking the rich, or physical comedy so absurd it forced laughter from the grief-stricken. In one account from Strasbourg, a jester named Piet the Red famously juggled rotten vegetables in the town square, shouting, "If the plague won't leave, at least we can throw our troubles at the sky." The crowd's laughter became a momentary antidote to fear. Both figures relied on symbolism as much as substance. The doctor's raven-like mask inspired both dread and reverence, while the jester's slapstick antics turned tragedy into farce. One treated visible wounds, the other invisible ones, and though neither could cure the plague, their shared legacy reveals a profound truth. In times of crisis, humanity reaches for every tool available, whether herb or humor. to keep the darkness at bay. The jester's laughter wasn't just entertainment, it was a weapon, sharpened by desperation and wielded with precision. In an age when speaking truth to power could mean losing one's head, the fool's motley was a license to skewer hypocrisy without consequence. Take the story of Triboulet, the infamous jester of King Francis I of France, who once quipped that the monarch smelled like his own decrees, full of hot air and rotten promises. The court gasped, but the king laughed, allowing the insult to linger as both joke and indictment. This was the jester's alchemy, wrapping hard truths in humor so biting it could draw blood, yet leave no scar. But the risks were real. When the bubonic plague emptied thrones as swiftly as peasant hovels, jesters walked a razor's edge. In London, a fool named Patch was said to have performed a skit mocking the city's quarantines, portraying nobles as rats fleeing a sinking ship. The performance earned him a night in the stocks until the very nobles he ridiculed, desperate for distraction, demanded his release. Like plague doctors braving infected homes, jesters gambled with their safety, betting that laughter could disarm rage as surely as herbs disinfected wounds. Their humor wasn't just defiance, it was diagnostic. A jester's satire acted like a mirror, forcing societies to confront their own follies. In Nuremberg during an outbreak, records tell of a jester who paraded through town with a puppet of the local bishop, its belly stuffed with gold coins while he chanted, "Prayers won't fill your plate, but his pockets weigh enough to sink a cathedral." The crowd's uneasy laughter revealed a grim truth. Faith alone couldn't stop starvation, yet corruption thrived. Where doctors probed swollen lymph nodes, jesters exposed swollen egos and broken systems. The parallels between these two figures deepen when we consider their shared audience. Plague doctors moved through a world where death was omnipresent. Jesters performed for people who knew they might be next. Both professions required a peculiar kind of courage, one to face disease head-on, the other to make light of the unthinkable. In Milan, a physician's journal from 1348 describes a jester performing for quarantined children, balancing a wooden plague mask on his nose while singing, "The reaper's busy, but so are we at dancing till our feet are free." The doctor who recorded it noted how, for the first time in weeks, the ward echoed with laughter instead of sobs. What made the jester's role so vital wasn't just the jokes, but the permission they gave others to feel joy amid horror. Their antics, whether mocking death itself or lampooning the futile edicts of panicked rulers, offered a fleeting sense of control. When a jester in Brussels donned a makeshift plague doctor costume during a performance, tripping over his own robes while declaring, "Fear's the real pestilence, and I've caught it too." The bit worked because it acknowledged the terror everyone shared. Like doctors applying poultices to wounds they couldn't heal, jesters applied laughter to grief they couldn't erase. This symbiotic relationship between healer and fool reaches its starkest clarity in their legacies. Plague doctors left behind treatises on miasma theory, jesters left behind folk songs and burlesques. Yet both traditions endure because they speak to the same human need, to confront darkness with whatever tools we have, be it a scalpel or a punchline. The masks may have changed, but the mission remains. Whether standing at a bedside or a throne's foot, both figures whispered the same defiant message. This horror is real, but so are we. And sometimes that's enough to keep the world from ending, at least for one more day. To the terrified townsfolk of medieval Europe, the sight of a plague doctor's beaked mask stirring through the mist was enough to send families barricading doors. These figures weren't just healers, they were walking omens, their very presence confirming a household's worst fears. Death has marked this place. Chroniclers describe mothers hiding children under floorboards at the sound of their rattling medicine carts, not from superstition, but because where plague doctors walked, corpses often followed. Their robes, steeped in vinegar and smoke, carried the scent of charred bedding and hastily dug graves. Even their attempts to help could feel like curses. When a doctor nailed a red cross to a door, it wasn't a symbol of hope, but a death sentence marking the home for quarantine. Small wonder many saw them as grim reapers in waxed leather. Jesters, by contrast, arrived like bursts of sunlight through storm clouds. Where plague doctors triggered hushed silences, fools sparked raucous laughter. Their value wasn't just in entertainment, but in their rare ability to invert fear. Take the account of a traveling jester in 14th century Florence who, upon entering a plague-stricken neighborhood, began parodying the somber death notices read in churches. Mimicking the town crier's grave tone, he announced absurd decrees. By order of the Almighty, all fleas are hereby evicted for unpaid rent. The crowd's laughter wasn't just relief, it was rebellion, a momentary refusal to let terror dictate their spirits. This dichotomy reveals a profound psychological divide. Plague doctors forced society to stare into the abyss. Jesters handed them a torch and dared them to laugh at the shadows. One embodied the cold truth that mortality didn't discriminate. Kings and cobblers alike choked on their own blood. The other offered the radical notion that joy, however fleeting, could still exist amid ruin. Records from Marseille describe a jester performing for quarantined sailors by balancing a skull on his chin while singing a ditty about the dance none escape. Macabre, absolutely, but by making death the punchline, he robbed it of some power. Yet both roles were equally fragile. Just as plague doctors couldn't truly halt the disease, jesters couldn't erase grief, they could only refract it through the prism of humor. A physician's failure meant bodies piled high. A jester's misstep could turn a crowd's laughter to rage. In Ghent, one fool was nearly stoned for joking that the rich died cleaner than the poor after local nobles received perfumed burials. The line between catharsis and cruelty was razor thin. What cemented their legacies wasn't success but symbolism. Long after the plagues faded, the plague doctor's mask endured as shorthand for epidemics, a warning etched into cultural memory. Jesters, meanwhile, became emblems of resilience, their cap and bells preserved in folklore as reminders that laughter could be as vital as medicine. Today, we see their echoes everywhere, in hazmat-suited health workers battling pandemics, in comedians cracking jokes during lockdowns. The costumes change, but the roles remain. One forces us to face reality, the other helps us survive it, and perhaps that's the most enduring lesson of all, that in humanity's darkest hours, we need both the courage to confront the truth and the audacity to laugh in its face. The plague doctor's fee could buy a peasant family's bread for months. In the ledgers of 14th century Florence, a single visit from one of these masked physicians cost as much as a skilled mason earned in half a year. Wealthy merchants paid gladly, desperate for any illusion of protection, while the poor relied on folk remedies, onion poultices, whispered prayers, or the grim hope that their poverty might make them invisible to death. This wasn't just healthcare, it was a brutal display of who lived and who died by the weight of their coin purse. Records from Paris show plague doctors rotating through noble households like seasonal servants, their beaked masks bobbing past starving crowds outside chateau gates. One account describes a countess demanding her physician wear fresh lavender in his mask each morning because the scent calmed her nerves, never mind that her servant slept 3 to a plague-ridden pallet. Jesters, by contrast, operated in a strange economic limbo. King's fools drew steady wages, their value measured in laughter rather than lives saved, but street performers relied on the generosity of audiences equally penniless. Yet here's the paradox: while plague doctors served the elite by design, jesters often bridge the class divide through sheer necessity. When courts fled to countryside estates during outbreaks, unemployed jesters migrated to public squares, trading satires of nobility for coppers. In the Nuremberg Chronicle, an illustration shows a fool performing atop a wooden crate beside a boarded-up apothecary's shop, his audience a mix of ragged children and hollow-eyed adults. His hat, once adorned with silk bells for royalty, now sported cracked pottery shards that clattered with every bow. The plague didn't erase hierarchy, it weaponized it. In Avignon, papal physicians prescribed gold-infused sun elixirs to cardinals while barber surgeons bled the poor with rusted lancets, but humor proved harder to quarantine. A jester in Milan was said to have scaled the locked gates of a quarantined slum, performing acrobatics for trapped residents who threw down rags tied with bread crusts as payment. Unlike medicine, laughter required no license, no Latin texts, no velvet-lined bags of herbs. It was a currency minted in desperation, traded freely across class lines. Both professions revealed society's fractures, but their responses diverged tellingly. Wealthy patrons commissioned plague doctors as human talismans, their presence a performance of control amid chaos. Meanwhile, jesters became unlikely equalizers, their jokes leveling the powerful and destitute alike. When the Duke of Burgundy's fool pierced the air with a song about lords, feasting while paupers chewed on plague boils, the nobleman's uneasy chuckle echoed alongside the cackles of kitchen scullions. Catastrophe had a way of making truths too dangerous to speak aloud suddenly permissible so long as they rhymed. Perhaps the most poignant legacy lies in what they left behind. Plague doctors' invoices survive in meticulous detail, itemized charges for leeches, rosewater rinses, even the wax used to seal death certificates. But jesters left no receipts. Their wages were laughter, their contracts etched in memory. One wasn't more vital than the other. They were twin responses to the same desperate human calculus. The wealthy paid to delay death, the poor traded coppers to forget it. And in that divide, two figures walked opposite paths toward the same impossible goal, to stitch a fraying world back together, whether with needle and thread or a punchline and a grin. When the Black Death carved its path through Europe, faith wasn't just a comfort, it was a framework for survival. The plague doctor's mask, with its haunting beak and glass-eyed stare, wasn't merely medical gear. To the terrified masses, it was a sacred relic, a grotesque halo marking its wearer as God's reluctant soldier. Chroniclers wrote of villagers crossing themselves as these figures passed, whispering prayers not just for healing but for absolution. In a world where disease was seen as divine punishment, the doctor's herbs and bloodletting rituals took on the weight of sacrament. Church bells tolled alongside the clatter of their medicine carts, a dissonant duet of desperation and devotion. Jesters, meanwhile, occupied a stranger spiritual niche. Though they mocked bishops and parodied hymns, their license to provoke came from an ancient belief that fools were touched by God, that their madness was a kind of cracked wisdom. Medieval calendars even marked Feast of Fools days when jesters led processions in stolen vestments, their antics not quite blasphemy, but something closer to holy satire. When plague struck, these performances took on new urgency. In Rouen, a jester named Colin the Cackler was said to have worn a plague doctor's mask backward during a performance, declaring it the only face that fits a world turned upside down by God's own jest. The crowd's laughter was edged with recognition. If suffering was a test, perhaps laughter was the answer. Superstition clung to both roles like mist. Plague doctors stuffed their masks with angelica root, not just for its antiseptic properties, but because folklore claimed it was revealed to a monk in a vision of the archangel Michael. Conversely, jesters harnessed chaos as prophecy. The infamous fool Myrdin of Wales supposedly predicted outbreaks by reading patterns in thrown chicken bones. a practice tolerated by clerics who dismissed it as madness until his eerie accuracy forced them to reconsider. Even the Jester's motley had spiritual significance. Its patchwork symbolized the fragmented nature of human understanding in the face of divine will. The Church's relationship with these figures was fraught. While bishops praised plague doctors as Christ's physicians, many distrusted their methods. A papal edict from 1350 even warned against those who play at physic with more show than substance, accusing some of exploiting fear for profit. Yet the same clergy who eyed doctors warily often sheltered jesters. In Strasbourg, a monastery chronicle describes a troop of fools given sanctuary during an outbreak, their performances deemed a balm for souls too weary for prayer. It was a tacit admission when scripture failed to comfort, perhaps a well-timed pratfall could. This tension between sacred and profane reveals a deeper truth about crisis response. Faced with the inexplicable, medieval societies reached for every tool at hand: holy water and harebrained schemes, incense and irreverence. The plague doctor's solemnity and the jester's mockery weren't opposites. They were two dialects of the same desperate language. One spoke in the measured tones of ritual, the other in the chaotic poetry of survival. And in their shared orbit around faith, they mirrored humanity's oldest negotiation, pleading with the divine for mercy while laughing through clenched teeth at the absurdity of it all. History often paints the medieval world in rigid strokes: knights and kings, monks and merchants, each locked into their assigned roles. But Catastrophe has a way of cracking open even the most stubborn traditions. Behind the beaked masks and motley costumes, women carved out spaces in professions that supposedly had no room for them. The records are sparse, scattered like fragments of pottery in an archaeological dig, but they tell a story of resilience that defies expectations. Take the case of Jehan La Folle, a name that appears in 14th century French court documents not as a noblewoman or nun, but as the sole female jester officially attached to a royal household. Unlike her male counterparts, she didn't rely on slapstick or bawdy songs. Chronicles describe her weapon as the needle of wit, a sharp, precise humor that punctured egos without breaking decorum. When the plague reached Paris in 1360, she reportedly quipped to the Dauphin, "Your Highness trembles at a fever, while your laundress boils shirts with corpses in the river." The line walked a razor's edge between jest and indictment, a reminder that crisis didn't erase hierarchy, it just made the cracks more visible. Female healers operated in even murkier territory. Without formal training or licenses, they worked in the shadows, often labeled as witches for their knowledge of herbs. Yet during outbreaks, desperate communities turned to them anyway. In the Italian town of Pistoia, municipal records list a certain Madonna Caterina paid to tend plague victims in 1348, not as a doctor's assistant, but as a practitioner in her own right. Her methods were pragmatic: vinegar-soaked cloths over the face, isolation of the sick, and a strict ban on visitors. The same town council that later burned a midwife for sorcery had willingly handed Caterina the keys to the pest house. Survival, it seems, could temporarily outweigh superstition. The duality of these roles was staggering. A female jester might mock a duke's cowardice one day and be barred from performing in the public square the next. A healer like Caterina could be revered during a crisis, then reviled when the danger passed. Their acceptance was conditional, tethered to the immediacy of disaster. Yet their very existence proves something profound. When death knocks at every door, societies will grasp at any hand offering help or hope, regardless of whose sleeve it wears. Perhaps the most telling detail lies in what happened when the plagues faded. Male jesters kept their positions, female fools vanished from records, licensed physicians reclaimed their authority, the Catarinas of the world were pushed back into obscurity. But for a fleeting moment, when the world was fractured and fear ruled, necessity had rewritten the rules, and in that temporary upheaval, women proved what they'd always known, that courage and wit weren't male or female traits, but human ones. The masks and motley might have been borrowed, but the hands that wore them were more than capable. For all their heroism and humor, the plague doctor and the jester walked perilous tightropes, one misstep from reverence to revulsion. The same desperation that made communities clutch at their robes could just as easily turn them into scapegoats. Consider the case of Dr. Heinrich von Staden, a physician in Frankfurt who charged exorbitant fees during an outbreak in 1362, promising immunity to wealthy families. When entire households perished despite his costly, miraculous elixirs, an enraged mob dragged him from his home and burned his beaked mask in the town square with him still inside it. His fate wasn't unique. Municipal records from Bruges list 7 plague doctors lynched in a single summer, their crimes ranging from stealing from the dead to simply failing to save the doomed. Jesters faced a different kind of danger, one born not of failed promises, but of truths told too sharply. The fool's cap might grant temporary immunity, but it wasn't a permanent shield. In 1409, the court jester of Duke John the Fearless of Burgundy was found hanged after performing a skit comparing the nobleman's war policies to a butcher stuffing sausages with his own people. The Duke himself allegedly attended the execution, remarking that the fool died as he lived mid-punchline. Even street performers weren't safe. A traveling jester in Lyon had his tongue nailed to a tavern table for joking that the bishop's prayers ran faster from the poor than the plague did. The darkest irony, both professions thrived on visibility, yet that very visibility made them targets. Plague doctors became living symbols of failure when treatments inevitably faltered. In Siena, crowds stoned a physician named Lorenzo after he publicly dissected a victim to prove the disease wasn't divine wrath, only for the onlookers to interpret the act as blasphemy. Jesters, meanwhile, danced on the knife's edge of privilege. Their role required walking up to the line of offense and occasionally stumbling over it. The same joke that earned applause one day might mean a whipping the next. Yet some dangers were quieter but no less deadly. Quack doctors peddling plague amulets made of crushed gemstones bankrupted families, while jesters who outlived their patrons often starved. The account of Marguerite the Laughing Goose, a jester abandoned by her court after the Black Death killed its nobility, ends with her begging outside a monastery, her once vibrant motley now gray as the ashes of the dead. Even success offered no guarantees. A Florentine plague doctor named Antonio famously survived 12 outbreaks only to be accused of witchcraft when his longevity seemed suspicious. His defense, "God favors fools and healers alike," didn't spare him the pyre. What makes these stories so chilling isn't just the violence, but the fickleness of public trust. Both roles existed in the space between gratitude and resentment, their value measured in lives saved or spirits lifted, metrics too fragile to last. A plague doctor might be hailed as a saint at dawn and reviled as a charlatan by dusk. A jester's laughter could turn to gallows humor in the space of a single ill-timed jest. Their shared lesson: in times of crisis, society crowns its saviors and crucifies them with the same trembling hands. And perhaps that's the most revealing paradox of all. Those who dared to stand between humanity and despair often became casualties of the very chaos they sought to tame. Long after the last plague carts rolled through medieval streets, the figures of the plague doctor and the jester lingered, not in flesh, but in pigment and parchment. Artists seized upon their stark visual power, transforming them into symbols that transcended their original roles. Look closely at Pieter Bruegel, the Elders, The Triumph of Death, and you'll spot them both. The plague doctor's beaked silhouette looming over a pile of corpses, while a jester in tattered motley clings to his wine jug, laughing even as skeletal hands drag victims into the abyss. Bruegel wasn't just painting scenes of doom, he was encoding a paradox. The doctor, meant to fight death, stands impotent beside it. The jester, whose role was frivolity, becomes the only one who seems to understand the absurdity of resisting the inevitable. These weren't just artistic choices, they were cultural shorthand. In illuminated manuscripts, jesters often appeared at the margins, their antics mocking the solemnity of sacred texts. A 15th century Book of Hours from Burgundy shows a fool pulling faces beside a prayer for deliverance from pestilence, as if to say, even in devotion, remember the folly of human pride. Meanwhile, plague doctors haunted woodcuts and broadsheets, their masks evolving from medical tools into emblems of mortality itself. Hans Holbein's Dance of Death series features a physician in full plague gear, his skeletal patient leading him by the hand, a grim punchline about the limits of human knowledge. The symbolism deepened in literature. In Boccaccio's Decameron, written during the Black Death's devastation, a group of nobles flee Florence to tell stories, their jester among them. His ribald tales aren't mere entertainment, they're lifelines tossed to drowning souls. Centuries later, Shakespeare would weave these archetypes into King Lear, where the fool's razor sharp jabs at the king's blindness mirror the plague doctor's futile battle against forces beyond control. Both figures became vessels for uncomfortable truth. That wisdom often wears the disguise of madness, and salvation might look like surrender. What makes their artistic legacy so enduring is its duality. The plague doctor's mask, once a practical barrier against miasma, became a universal icon of pandemics, echoed in modern hazmat suits and apocalyptic fiction. The jester's cap, with its jingling bells, evolved into a symbol of subversion, appearing in everything from protest art to corporate logos as a wink at authority. Even their juxtaposition held meaning. A German broadsheet from 1582 depicts death as a jester, his skeletal fingers plucking the strings of a lute while a plague doctor dances helplessly beside him. The message is clear. In the face of oblivion, all human efforts, whether science or satire, are just different kinds of performance. Perhaps that's why these figures still resonate. They don't just belong to the Middle Ages, they're mirrors held up to every era's crises. When modern artists sketch pandemic responders in gas masks or comedians roast politicians during lockdowns, they're channeling the same timeless dynamic. The plague doctor reminds us of our fragility, the jester of our stubborn refusal to let that fragility define us. And in that tension between dread and defiance, art finds its most potent fuel. Centuries may separate us from the plague-riddled streets of medieval Europe, but the dance between healers and humorists hasn't changed. It's only swapped costumes. When the COVID-19 pandemic locked down cities in 2020, the world witnessed a hauntingly familiar pattern unfold. Frontline workers in hazmat suits and N95 masks became our modern plague doctors, their faces obscured by plastic shields instead of beaked leather, yet carrying the same weight of hope and dread. Meanwhile, late-night hosts broadcasting from empty studios and TikTok comedians lip-syncing through quarantine played the jester's age-old role, cutting tension with punchlines about sourdough starters and toilet paper hoarders. The parallels aren't just poetic, they're proof that when crisis strikes, humanity still reaches for the same twin lifelines, science to fight the virus and satire to fight the despair. Take the way we elevated healthcare workers during the pandemic's peak. Like the plague doctors of old, they were simultaneously revered and feared, applauded from balconies one moment, then avoided on sidewalks the next. In New York City, nurses described neighbors crossing the street to avoid their scrubs, as if the fabric itself carried contagion. Yet social media brimmed with murals depicting them as angels, their PP wings outstretched. This duality mirrored medieval attitudes exactly, the healer as both savior and omen. Even the rituals returned. Where plague doctors burned herbs to purify air, we Clorox wiped groceries and set up UV light sanitizing stations. The methods evolved, but the impulse didn't to perform acts of control when control was slipping away. Comedians, meanwhile, inherited the Jester's precarious mantle. When lockdowns cancelled live shows, humor migrated online, with performers like John Krasinski hosting some good news from his living room, or Sarah Cooper's viral Trump lip syncs turning political chaos into cathartic laughter. Like their medieval counterparts, these modern fools walked a tightrope. A joke about Zoom glitches might land perfectly, but satire about vaccine inequity risked backlash. Yet the demand was undeniable. Studies showed a surge in comedy consumption during lockdowns, with viewers reporting it helped them cope. Just as Jesters once performed for quarantined crowds from overturned carts, comedians now broadcast to isolated audiences through screens, their punchlines stitching together a fractured sense of community. The most striking parallel lies in how both roles exposed societal fractures. Medieval plague doctors navigated the gap between rich and poor. Modern healthcare systems revealed similar divides. Celebrities flaunted early vaccine access while essential workers waited, sparking outrage that echoed the resentment of peasants watching nobles receive gold-infused sun elixirs. Meanwhile, comedians became truth-tellers, their jokes highlighting systemic failures. Trevor Noah's bit about panic buying privilege or Hassan Minhaj's takedowns of pandemic profiteers served the same function as a jester mocking a bishop's greed, social critique disguised as entertainment. Perhaps the deepest connection is in the aftermath. Like the plague doctors and jesters who faded into obscurity once crises passed, many frontline workers found their applause replaced by burnout and staffing shortages. The comedians who kept us sane, some saw their platforms shrink as normalcy returned. Yet their legacy lingers, just as the medieval figures endure in art and folklore. The hazmat suit and the late-night monologue are our era's beaked mask and motley, symbols of how we weather storms by tending to both body and spirit. And that's the enduring lesson. Pandemics may change their names, but humanity's playbook for survival remains written in the same two languages, the solemnity of science and the rebellious laughter that refuses to let fear have the last word. The plague doctor's beaked mask wasn't just protective gear, it was a stage prop in a desperate theatrical production where the stakes were life and death. Every element of their appearance, from the waxed leather robe to the incense-smoldering beak, served a dual purpose: to shield the wearer from miasma, yes, but also to convince terrified onlookers that someone had control over the chaos. Their very presence was a performance, a carefully choreographed spectacle of authority in an era when actual medical knowledge was shockingly rudimentary. Consider the way they carried their infamous cane, not just to examine patients at a safe distance, but to gesture like conductors directing an orchestra of disease. Theatrics weren't incidental, they were the backbone of their practice. Meanwhile, in the same smoke-filled streets, physicians who avoided such costumes were quietly advancing real science. At the University of Padua, dissections of plague victims revealed early insights into contagion, while Arab doctors like Ibn Khatama documented symptoms with clinical precision. The contrast couldn't be starker, one group cloaked in mystery, the other peeling back layers of flesh to understand the body's truths. Yet even these pioneers couldn't escape performance entirely. When the Paduan anatomist Gentile da Foligno published his plague treatise, he wrapped his observations in astrological charts, knowing his audience expected celestial explanations alongside bodily ones. Medicine wasn't yet free from the stagecraft of belief. Jesters, too, blurred the line between performance and therapy, but with a crucial difference. Where plague doctors used theater to mask ignorance, fools used it to expose truth. Take the laughing cure described in medieval texts, a practice where jesters were summoned to the bedsides of melancholic nobles, their antics prescribed like medicine. A 13th century manuscript from Montpellier even lists specific jokes for humoral imbalances, treating laughter as a diagnostic tool. When a jester in King Charles VI's court performed a skit about the monarch's own paranoia during his bouts of madness, the court held its breath. Was this cruelty or catharsis? The king's laughter, followed by moments of eerie clarity, suggested the latter. This interplay between showmanship and healing reveals a timeless tension. Plague doctors embodied the paradox of needing to perform competence when none existed, their costumes compensating for the grim reality that their best remedies were guesswork. Jesters, conversely, weaponized absurdity to make unbearable truths digestible. One hid behind ritual, the other exposed through ridicule. Yet both answers sprang from the same human impulse. When faced with the unimaginable, we dress our survival strategies in costumes, whether leather or motley. And perhaps that's why their legacies endure, not because they had all the answers, but because they taught us that sometimes the performance is the treatment. In the shadowed wards of medieval infirmaries, where the air reeked of vinegar and despair, an unlikely medicine was dispensed not from apothecary jars, but from the lips of grinning fools. Records from the Hôtel Dieu in Paris describe jesters making weekly rounds as early as 1327, their bawdy songs echoing off stone walls where prayers had failed to lift the gloom. One account tells of a jester named Pippin the Sour, ironically famed for his honeyed wit, who performed for feverish children, balancing wooden spoons on his nose while singing nonsense rhymes about the plague that lost its trousers. Nurses noted that after his visits, even the most listless patients would briefly revive, their laughter cutting through the relentless drone of pain. Physicians took heed. The famed surgeon Guy de Chauliac included in his plague treat is a curious prescription. For melancholy humors, let the fool attend the bedside thrice weekly, his jests to be taken with wine and honey. This wasn't mere entertainment, it was early psychiatry. Medieval medicine operated on the theory of the four humors, where joy was considered as vital as any herb. A 15th century Florentine health manual advised that mirth stirs the blood better than leeches, and monastery infirmaries often employed resident jesters to chase the black bile from depressed monks. At the Abbey of Cluny, the infirmarian's ledger lists payments to a fool called Brother Jocundus, whose sole duty was to make the sick laugh with exaggerated imitations of the abbot's sermons. The results were striking enough that marginal notes describe patients recovering their appetites after his performances, their cold humors warmed by merriment. Parallels to modern mental health practices are startling. When jesters pantomimed doctors' pompous diagnoses or turned death itself into a bumbling villain in their skits, they were practicing a crude form of exposure therapy, helping patients confront fears through humor. In Krakow, a chronicle describes a jester who cured a nobleman's panic attacks by wearing a plague doctor costume backward and tripping over his own robes, reducing the terrified court to helpless giggles. Today's hospitals use clown doctors for pediatric patients, their red noses echoing the jester's bells, because we've rediscovered what medieval Europe knew instinctively. Laughter doesn't just mask pain, it metabolizes it. Perhaps the most poignant evidence comes from personal accounts. The diary of a Breton merchant's wife, surviving in a Strasbourg archive, describes her convalescence after losing 3 children to fever. "Then came the fool with his puppet of a weeping angel," she writes. "He made it sneeze so mightily its wings fell off, and for the first time in months I remembered how to breathe." Centuries before neuroscience explained endorphins, before therapists coined cognitive reframing, these motley-clad healers wielded joy like a scalpel, cutting through the calcified weight of grief. Their legacy lingers not in medical textbooks, but in the unshakable human conviction that sometimes the best medicine isn't swallowed, it's shared. Long after the last plague victim was buried, the plague doctor refused to fade into history instead. He stalked into legend, his beaked mask morphing from medical tool into something far more unsettling. Across Europe, folktales sprouted like mushrooms after rain, painting these figures as anything from ghostly guardians to damned souls cursed to wander. In Venetian lore, the Dotta della Peste became a spectral figure said to appear in alleyways before outbreaks, his empty eye sockets gleaming behind glass lenses as he tapped his cane against cobblestones in a rhythmic warning. German peasants whispered of the pestman, a once mortal physician who made a pact with death to save his village, only to become its eternal herald, doomed to walk the earth wherever pestilence stirred. These myths reveal a cultural whiplash. The same communities that once clung to plague doctors as lifelines later transformed them into omens, their very image blurred between healer and horror. An Alpine legend tells of a masked figure seen during the 1600s, moving through a blizzard toward a doomed village. When a brave midwife tore off his mask, she found not a face but a hollow void, as if the sickness itself had put on human robes. What's fascinating is how these stories invert the doctor's original role. No longer flawed men fighting disease, they became supernatural forces embodying it, their costumes shifting from protective gear to second skins. Jester folklore took a eerily parallel path. Where plague doctors became spectral, jesters turned uncannily immortal. The Welsh tale of Myrddin Effaul describes a jester who served 7 kings across 3 centuries, his laughter never aging even as monarchs turned to dust. In Prague, the Večný Šešek Eternal Fool was said to materialize during times of crisis, his bells jingling on deserted streets as he mocked disasters yet to come. Unlike the plague doctor's grim metamorphosis, the jester's myth celebrated his refusal to succumb, not to disease but to time itself. The contrasts are striking. Plague doctor legends fester with guilt and punishment, reflecting society's unresolved trauma. A Sicilian story claims any child who touches a discarded plague mask will sicken by dawn, a clear metaphor for the lingering fear of contagion. Jester myths, meanwhile, bubble with rebellious continuity. The French fall sempiternal doesn't just outlive kings, he buries them with a punchline, his epitaphs becoming nursery rhymes. One served as medieval Europe's ID, the other its superego, the first a reminder of consequences, the second that irreverence outlasts even death. Yet in their shared supernaturalism, both figures fulfilled a deeper need to make the incomprehensible feel intentional. Random disease became the plague doctor's curse, chaotic history the jester's running gag. By anthropomorphizing catastrophe, these tales gave people a target for their rage or a font for their hope. And perhaps that's why they endure not as history but as psychology, reminding us that when reality terrifies, the human mind will always dress its fears in stories. The plague doctor's robe wasn't just clothing, it was a fortress stitched from waxed leather and superstition. Every element, from the ankle-length coat to the beaked mask, served as psychological armor as much as physical protection. The fabric, soaked in vinegar and rendered fat, created a literal barrier against miasma. but it also transformed the wearer into something otherworldly, a figure who could walk through hellfire unscathed. Glass eyepieces turned their gaze into something inhuman, while the long cane kept suffering at arm's length. This wasn't just practicality, it was theater of survival. When townspeople saw that silhouette approaching, they weren't just witnessing a healer, they were seeing a living symbol of separation between the healthy and the doomed. The robe whispered, "This horror cannot touch me. Perhaps it won't touch you either." Now flip the script to the Jester's motley, a riot of clashing colors and jangling bells that screamed defiance in the face of despair. Where the plague doctor's outfit aimed to intimidate and isolate, the fool's costume was an open invitation to chaos. The patchwork fabric, often sewn from scraps of discarded nobleware, was a walking satire of social order. Those mismatched diamonds and triangles weren't just whimsy, they mirrored the fractured world outside, and the bells, they turned every step into a punchline, as if to say, you can't mourn when you're too busy wincing at this racket. The genius of these costumes lay in their opposite approaches to the same enemy. The plague doctor's robe built walls, the jester's motley tore them down. One silenced crowds with its ominous presence, the other shattered silence with cacophony. Both were carefully crafted illusions, performances designed to manipulate emotion. A doctor's waxed coat suggested impenetrable expertise, even when its wearer was just a second-rate apothecary. A jester's floppy had disguised razor-sharp social commentary as buffoonery. Their clothing didn't just reflect their roles, it weaponized them. Consider the symbolism stitched into every thread. The plague doctor's ensemble borrowed from priestly vestments, its floor-length robe echoing ecclesiastical garb to borrow divine authority. Meanwhile, the jester's outfit inverted sacred imagery. His scepter was a slapstick, his crown a donkey-eared cap. One costume whispered of order and ritual, the other cackled at its futility. Yet both served the same desperate purpose, to give their wearers, and those who watched them, a sense of control. When reality offered none, these garments became the last bastion of agency. A doctor could clutch his robe like a talisman, a jester could hide behind his bells. Even their colors told a story. The plague doctor's uniform leaned into darkness, charcoal grays, deep browns, colors that absorbed grief. The jester's palette was a deliberate assault on sorrow, emerald greens, sunflower yellows, crimson reds that dared death to dim them. One outfit blended into the shadows of pest houses, the other exploded like fireworks in a cathedral. Yet both were survival tactics. When the world turned monochrome with mourning, these costumes forced the eye to remember vibrancy, the most telling detail. How these outfits evolved when plagues faded. Plague doctors' robes stiffened into museum relics, their terror neutralized by time. But Jester's motley lived on, in Harlequin romances, in comic book villains, even in modern protest garb. Because while we outgrew the need for miasma-proof armor, we never stopped craving uniforms of rebellion. The doctor's robe was a relic of fear, the jester's patches. A battle flag stitched from laughter, still flapping in the wind. The plague doctor's mask erased its wearer's humanity, transforming him into a faceless omen, no smile, no frown, just the blank stare of glass lenses and that grotesque bird-like beak. This wasn't just protection, it was psychological warfare waged against the plague itself. By stripping away individuality, the mask turned its wearer into something more and less than human, a vessel for both hope and dread. Villagers who encountered these figures spoke of their uncanny silence, how they communicated only through gestures or the tapping of their canes. Without a visible mouth, their voices seemed to emanate from the mask itself, lending their pronouncements an eerie, oracular weight. When a masked doctor declared a house quarantined, It wasn't a man speaking, it was the plague's own herald. Now contrast that with the jester's face, a canvas of exaggerated grimaces, smeared grease paint, and rolling eyes. Where the plague doctor's mask concealed, the fool's makeup revealed. His every expression was amplified tenfold. A wink became a leer, a smirk a grotesque pantomime of mockery. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a deliberate unmasking of society's hypocrisies. While nobles hid behind stoic dignity and priests behind solemnity, the jester's face became a funhouse mirror, reflecting truths too raw for polite company. In the court of Burgundy, one fool was famed for his silent sermons, skits where he'd contort his face into caricatures of the bishop's piety or the duke's greed, letting the audience's laughter fill in the words he never spoke. Both costumes played with anonymity, but to opposite ends. The plague doctor's mask created distance, its wearer untouchable as a saint or a specter. The jester's grease paint invited intimacy, his exaggerated features pulling the crowd into conspiracy. One hid behind leather and wax, the other stripped bare the artifice of power by wearing artifice itself like a banner. Consider the symbolism: a doctor's mask stuffed with herbs to filter corruption, a jester's rouge-smeared cheeks mimicking the flush of life in a world gone pale with fear. Both faces were lies, and yet, in their deception, they exposed deeper truths. The brilliance of these disguises lay in their flexibility. A plague doctor's mask could belong to anyone: a seasoned physician, a quack, or a desperate volunteer. That anonymity granted authority precisely because it erased the man beneath. Meanwhile, a jester's painted grin could slip between personas in a heartbeat. One moment a bawdy clown, the next a philosopher in motley. Records from Milan describe a fool who performed an entire satire about tax collectors, using only a handful of masks, switching between them so swiftly the audience gasped at the transformations. The plague doctor's unchanging visage whispered, "I am death's equal." The jester's shifting faces retorted, "And I am its plaything." Yet for all their differences, both costumes shared a secret purpose: to protect their wearers while they did the dangerous work of confronting what others couldn't bear to face. The plague doctor's mask shielded lungs from miasma, yes, but it also shielded hearts from the unbearable intimacy of watching strangers die. The jester's makeup wasn't just pigment, it was armor against retaliation, allowing him to say with a smirk what would earn another man the gallows. In the end, both faces were survival tactics. One turned its wearer into an avatar of order amid chaos, the other, a living reminder that sometimes chaos is the only sane response to a world unmoored. And perhaps that's why they endure in our imagination, not as relics, but as mirrors. However we disguise ourselves to face our own plagues, however we laugh to keep from screaming, we're still speaking their silent language. The mortality ledger of the Black Death makes for brutal reading, but between its lines lies a striking disparity. Plague doctors died in droves, their very profession a death sentence wrapped in waxed leather. Records from Venice's health board list 64 physicians hired during the outbreak of 1576. By year's end, 58 were dead. In Marseille, a single plague doctor's contract chillingly stipulated his pay would double if he survives past Michaelmas. Most didn't. Their proximity to the infected, compounded by primitive protections and the era's medical ignorance, turned them into sacrificial figures statistically more likely to perish than the patients they treated. Jesters, by contrast, enjoyed a morbid kind of job security. While pestilence emptied thrones and gutted villages, the fool's cap often proved as effective as a charm against death. Court payrolls from the period showed jesters retained their positions through multiple outbreaks, their salaries paid uninterrupted even as gravediggers worked overtime. The reason, pure economics. A skilled jester was a rarity, a living instrument nobles couldn't bear to retune. When the Duke of Milan's court fled the plague in 1485, his physician was left behind to tend the sick. His fool rode in the ducal carriage deemed too precious to lose. This grim favoritism reveals society's hierarchy of needs in crisis. Plague doctors were expendable because their function was replicable. Any apothecary's apprentice could stuff herbs into a beak mask and play the part, but a jester who could make a paranoid king laugh during a pandemic. That required years of finely honed instinct. The doctor's value lay in his replaceable knowledge, the fool's in his irreplaceable humanity. Even their living conditions diverged drastically. Physicians slept in pest houses amid the dying, while jesters often resided in palace quarters, not out of kindness, but because misery makes poor comedy. A depressed fool was as useless as a dry well. The survival gap widened further when outbreaks struck the lower classes. Street jesters who performed in taverns and markets faced higher risks than their courtly counterparts, yet still outlasted local healers. A London guild ledger from 1592 notes 3 jesters performing at the Cross Keys Inn throughout the plague's peak, while all 7 of the parish's plague nurses perished. Why laughter became a currency more stable than silver. When bread grew scarce and coffins plentiful, people would trade their last penny for an hour's escape, but few would risk touching a doctor's contaminated coin purse. Perhaps the darkest irony lies in how each role was memorialized. Graveyards from the period show plague doctors buried in mass pits, their masks tossed aside like broken tools. Jesters, however, often rated individual tombs not from sentiment but as status symbols. The epitaph of Charles the Bold's fool reads, "Here lies Pietkin who made tyrants giggle." No such stone marks the resting place of the physician who bled Charles's buboes. Societies that couldn't spare a candle to honor their healers would commission marble monuments to the men who'd mocked them. This imbalance speaks volumes about human nature. We've always been willing to sacrifice those who confront our pain, while clinging fiercely to those who help us forget it. The plague doctor's tragedy wasn't just his high mortality rate, it was being both essential and disposable. The jester's privilege wasn't immunity, but the rare assurance that in a world where everything was taken, his laughter would always be worth keeping. When the wealthy fled Milan in 1485, their carriages piled high with silks and silver, one figure remained behind, a physician named Antonio di Guido, who nailed his own quarantine notice to the cathedral doors. "Let those who fear death run," he reportedly scrawled beneath the Red Cross. "I stay with those who cannot." His journals, preserved in the city archives, detail the grim calculus of his choice. Of the 600 souls he tended in the pest house, 400 perished. Yet his final entry, smudged with what might be wine or tears, insists the math still favored courage. 20 men lived who would have died alone. That is enough. Across the square, another unlikely holdout held court in the abandoned market, a jester known only as Zani, whose real name was lost when the notaries who recorded it fled. Eyewitness accounts describe him performing daily atop the empty fishmonger's stall, his bells muffled with cloth to respect the dying. He juggled onions when bread ran out, wrote a surviving spice merchant, and made the children laugh by pretending to sneeze coins from his sleeve. When the bishop's own chaplain deserted his post, Zani donned a stolen cassock and delivered a mock sermon titled, "How to Flee Like a Saint." The laughter that echoed through the deserted piazza was, according to one account, the first sound other than weeping heard in weeks. These weren't isolated acts of bravery. They were part of a pattern etched into the darkest chapters of pandemic history. In Strasbourg, a Jewish physician named Jacob von Trier defied both plague and pogroms to treat Christian and Jewish patients alike, boiling his own urine to create sterile compresses when the guild denied him supplies. His contemporary, the fool Hans Klopfer, was said to have moved into the city's orphanage, teaching the children to make plague puppets from rags and sticks. The sickness takes parents reads a surviving fragment of his patter, but never silly voices. What bound these figures together wasn't just circumstance, but a shared understanding of service that transcended profession. The plague doctor's oath compelled him to stay. The jester's unspoken code demanded he make staying bearable. Both roles required staring into the abyss, one to fight it, the other to mock its pretensions. In Venice, when the famed physician Giovanni della Porta succumbed to plague after months of treating the poor, his funeral procession included an unexpected honor guard. 12 jesters from neighboring cities, their bells silenced, their caps doffed. The gesture spoke louder than any eulogy. The cruelest test came when loyalty collided with survival. In London's 1625 outbreak, apothecary James Roos recorded in his ledger how he turned away his own infected wife to keep treating patients, only to find a jester had smuggled her into the pest house disguised as a male orderly. The fool's antics hid his kindness, Roos later wrote, as his motley hid the man. Their silent partnership, the doctor providing medicine, the jester smuggling letters between the quarantined and their families, saved dozens from despair. These stories peel back the layers of medieval society to reveal its beating heart. Behind the masks and grease paint were people who chose, again and again, to stand where others stepped back. Not for glory, plague doctors were rarely celebrated in their lifetimes, and jesters even less so, but because someone had to. The physician's science might fail, the fool's jokes might land flat, but their presence alone whispered the most vital lie of all: you are not abandoned. In the end, that fragile promise stitched together from herb bundles and punchlines proved as vital as any cure. Long after the last plague victim was buried, the whispers of those dark days clung to European tongues like the aftertaste of bitter medicine. Proverbs sprouted from the trauma, crystallizing hard-won lessons into phrases simple enough for children to chant, yet profound enough to shape generations. Fear spreads faster than fever, warned a German saying from the 1500s, distilling the observation that panic could empty villages before the plague ever arrived. In Italy, mothers hushed crying infants with the rhyme, "Ride, bambino, o la peste ti sent," laugh, child, or the plague will hear you, a chilling blend of superstition and psychological insight, suggesting joy might be armor against misfortune. These weren't just folk wisdom, they were survival strategies forged in fire. The French adage, "Un fou rit là où un sage pleure," a fool laughs where a wise man weeps, captured the jester's paradoxical power to reframe despair. Meanwhile, plague doctors haunted the collective memory through sayings like the Dutch, "Het masker van de dokter is de doodskap van de levenden." The doctor's mask is the death's head of the living, a reminder that healers carried the scent of mortality with them. The contrast between these sayings reveals a cultural tug of war. Terror demanded solemnity, but survival sometimes required irreverence. The most telling legacy, though, lies in how these roles seeped into everyday language. To play the fool in medieval England didn't just mean clowning. It meant speaking painful truths under the guise of madness, a skill honed in pestilence's shadow. Conversely, calling someone a plague doctor in Renaissance Venice implied hollow promises behind a fearsome facade. Even children's games preserved the dichotomy. A Flemish folk game called Doctor en Dwaas, Doctor and Fool, had one child in a paper beak mask chasing others, while the fool freed captured players by making them laugh, a literal enactment of their historic dynamic. Artifacts tell the same story. A 16th century Swiss amulet carved from bog oak shows a plague doctor on one side, a laughing jester on the other, the inscription reading Gegen beide Waffen, against both weapons. It's a physical testament to the era's dual coping mechanisms: ward off disease with science, repel despair with satire. Similarly, tavern signs from Prague to Portsmouth often paired images of masked doctors and grinning fools, a visual toast to the twin spirits of resilience. Yet the darkest lessons linger in proverbs about complacency. The Italian finita la peste, dimenticato il dotter, plague ends, doctor forgotten, and its counterpart, il buffone, rides solo in tempo di pace. The fool laughs alone in peacetime, speak to humanity's short memory. Both figures thrived in crisis, only to be discarded when the world brightened, a cyclical betrayal that repeats in every pandemic's aftermath. Today, we see their echoes in how quickly we applaud frontline workers, then slash their budgets, or how comedians who buoyed us through lockdown struggle for gigs when normalcy returns. Perhaps the most enduring proverb comes from a stained glass window in a Normandy church, where a jester and plague doctor flank a risen Christ, the inscription below reading, Ils ont porté nos deux croix, they carried our two crosses. It's a rare acknowledgement that in humanity's darkest hours, salvation came not just from saints, but from the masked and the motley, those who bore the weight of our fear and our need to laugh in its face. Their legacy isn't just in the sayings they inspired, but in the uncomfortable truth those words carry, that healing and humor aren't opposites, but the twin stitches holding the fabric of civilization together when it threatens to unravel. Modern media loves to dress history in costumes, sometimes at the expense of truth. Take the plague doctor's beaked mask, now a staple of steampunk cosplay and horror games. Pop culture paints these figures as either sinister villains or noble saviors, but the reality was far messier. For every dedicated physician like Nostradamus, who actually did pioneer some effective plague treatments, there were a dozen charlatans peddling miracle cures made of crushed gemstones or pigeon dung. Yet the myth that all plague doctors were frauds is equally false. Municipal records from Venice show strict licensing for physicians during outbreaks, with harsh penalties for quacks. The truth, they were a mixed bag, some heroes, some hustlers, most just desperate men doing their best with the scant science they had. Jesters suffer the opposite distortion. Films like A Knight's Tale or The Court Jester depict them as eternally grinning tricksters, their lives one long carnival. But medieval payrolls and personal diaries reveal a darker reality. The fool's laughter was often a performance masking profound pain. Take the case of Will Sommers, Henry VIII's jester, whose private writings describe nights spent weeping into the hound's bowl after entertaining a king who executed his friends. Many jesters were disabled or disfigured, employed precisely because their bodies were considered humorous. A 15th century German woodcut shows a hunchbacked fool with the caption, "My back bears what your heart hides." Their humor wasn't just light-hearted mockery, it was survival, a way to transform their own suffering into currency. Video games especially love to romanticize these roles. Assassin's Creed portrays plague doctors as shadowy assassins, while Dragon Age turns them into mystical healers. In reality, their daily grind was less glamorous, boiling lice-ridden bandages, tallying deaths in ledgers, and enduring townsfolk's spit when treatments failed. Even the iconic beaked mask was rarer than pop culture suggests. Many doctors wore simple cloth wraps soaked in vinegar, their uniforms dictated by poverty, not theatrics. The Jester's modern rebranding is just as telling. From Game of Thrones to The Witcher, they're portrayed as whip-smart truth-tellers, their barbs always landing perfectly. Real court fools had to calibrate every joke like surgeons. A millimeter too deep could mean exile or execution. The infamous case of Tribulate, who joked about King Francis I's impotence, only escaped beheading because the king's sister intervened. For every clever quip preserved in chronicles, there were 100 swallowed silences. Perhaps the biggest misconception is that these roles existed in isolation. Films show plague doctors stalking deserted streets alone, but they often worked alongside nuns, barber surgeons, and even jesters who volunteered in infirmaries. A fresco in Siena's Santa Maria della Scala shows a rare collaboration: a masked doctor tending a child's buboes while a jester distracts him with a puppet show. This wasn't artistic license. Hospital archives confirm such partnerships. The divide between solemn healer and merry fool was far blurrier than fiction admits. The takeaway: these figures deserve more than caricature. Reducing plague doctors to sinister bird men or jesters to eternal optimists strips them of their humanity, the very quality that made them resonate across centuries. They weren't symbols, they were people, flawed, frightened, and occasionally magnificent, navigating a world where death and laughter were never more than a breath apart. Picture a plague doctor kneeling beside a dying child, pressing a writhing leech to her swollen lymph nodes while her mother weeps. Was this healing or harm dressed in waxed leather? The ethical quagmire surrounding these figures runs deep, their methods often as cruel as the disease they fought. Take the infamous treatments scrawled in 14th century medical texts, from smearing mercury on open sores to bleeding patients already weakened by dehydration. Many cures accelerated death rather than preventing it. Yet before we judge too harshly, consider the context. With no understanding of bacteria or viruses, these practitioners were working from a playbook where balancing humors seemed as scientific as germ theory does today. Their failures weren't always born of malice, sometimes just the tragic limits of human knowledge crashing against desperation. Jesters faced their own moral tightropes. When a fool in plague-ridden Strasbourg performed a skit mocking the agonized death throes of the infected, was this catharsis or cruelty? Chroniclers describe audiences howling with laughter, but also note the bereaved storming out in tears. The jester's defense would have been simple. In a world where corpses piled faster than gravediggers could bury them, sometimes the only way to process horror was to make it ridiculous. Yet lines undeniably crossed into exploitation. The diary of a Florentine merchant recounts a jester who charged families extra to roast their dead in verse, turning personal grief into public punchlines for coin. The core dilemma hinges on consent. Plague doctors rarely explained their brutal methods to feverish patients. Jesters rarely asked mourners if they wanted their loss satirized. Both operated under a medieval version of the ends justify the means, doctors believing any chance of survival excused suffering, jesters arguing any laughter was medicinal. But records suggest some wrestled with these choices. Physician Henry de Mondeville's journal confesses his guilt over prescribing tortures disguised as cures, while the jester Jacques Lafol was reportedly whipped for refusing to mock a disfigured plague survivor. Perhaps the most revealing counterpoint comes from those they served. Guild ledgers show plague doctors sometimes paid reparations to families of victims, evidence of recognized harm. Yet the same documents list jesters receiving bonuses for lifting spirits in darkest hours. Society seemed to accept that both roles required moral compromise, so long as they occasionally worked. This brutal pragmatism echoes in modern parallels, the doctor prescribing addictive painkillers because they're better than nothing, the comedian mining tragedy for clicks. The real lesson isn't about medieval ethics, it's about how easily we excuse questionable actions when we're desperate for solutions or escape. What lingers isn't just the shadow of their choices, but the light they occasionally spark. For every charlatan peddling snake oil, there was a doctor like Raymond Chalin in Avignon, who turned his own home into a hospice despite knowing his methods were flawed. For every jester who crossed the line, another like Margaret Lafolle used her act to shame nobles into funding orphanages. Their legacy challenges us to ask, in our own crises, where do we draw the line between what's effective and what's right? And how much of our judgment is hindsight versus the raw calculus of survival in the moment? The masks may have changed, but the dilemmas remain. The beaked masks and motley caps didn't vanish overnight, they faded like ink on weathered parchment, their decline as gradual as the world's slow pivot toward modernity. For plague doctors, the death knell came with the quiet triumph of science. By the late 1700s, germ theory began unraveling the mystery of contagion, rendering the ominous bird-like visage more macabre relic than medical tool. An etching from Vienna's medical archives captures the turning point. A young doctor in a clean linen coat disdainfully holding a plague mask at arm's length, its herb-stuffed beak crumbling to dust. The caption reads, "Superstition's retirement." Yet something subtler was lost in this progress, the visceral reassurance of a figure who, however flawed, stood between humanity and the abyss. When cholera swept London in 1832, newspapers noted an eerie public nostalgia for the devil doctors of old, their very theatrics having offered a psychological bulwark that sterile clinics couldn't replicate. Jesters slipped away more delicately, their exit orchestrated not by obsolescence but by changing tastes. As European courts embraced Enlightenment ideals, the fool's cap began to seem embarrassingly medieval, a relic of a less refined age. Louis XVI's dismissal of his last court jester in 1789 wasn't just a personnel change, it was a cultural statement. The official decree cited the need for dignified entertainment, a phrase that would have made any self-respecting fool snort into his wine. Yet even as jesters vanished from palaces, their spirit stubbornly persisted. You could trace their lineage through the rise of political cartoonists, whose pen and ink satires cut as deep as any jester's barb, or in the Shakespearean clowns who migrated from throne rooms to theater stages. The motley was discarded, but the mockery lived on. What vanished with them wasn't just roles, but entire languages of resilience. The plague doctor's costume had been a kind of visual incantation, a way to ritualize fear into something manageable. When it disappeared, so did the collective understanding that confronting death sometimes requires ceremony as much as serum. Similarly, the court jester's license to speak truth through laughter left a void no polite satirist could fill. After the French Revolution guillotined the last royal fools, one surviving wit scrawled in his diary, "Now every man must wear his own motley, and none do it half so well." Yet their departures made room for unexpected gains. As plague doctors faded, public health systems emerged less theatrical but far more effective. The quarantines they'd pioneered became standardized. Their crude isolation practices evolved into epidemiology. Jesters, meanwhile, democratized. What had been the privilege of kings trickled down to coffeehouse comics and newspaper columnists. The fool's ancient right to critique power now belonged to anyone with a sharp enough tongue or pen. The final irony, both roles found resurrection in the places they'd least expect. Plague doctors became darlings of Gothic fiction, their eerie silhouettes repurposed as symbols of existential dread in poems and penny dreadfuls. Jesters, once tethered to courts, exploded into popular culture opera buffoons, circus clowns, even the grinning mascots of revolution. their essence proved too vital to disappear entirely. Like shadows stretching at dusk, they simply changed shape, reminding us that society will always need both those who stare down darkness and those who jest at its heels. Medieval streets may lie centuries behind us, but the dance between data and delight they perfected remains shockingly relevant today. Think about the last crisis that upended your world, whether a global pandemic or personal upheaval, and recall how you coped. Chances are you reached for the same twin lifelines as those 14th century souls, cold facts to navigate the storm and warm humor to endure it. Our modern plague doctors wear lab coats instead of waxed leather, but their mission hasn't changed. Epidemiologists tracking variants with algorithms, nurses working double shifts in overwhelmed ICUs. They're the spiritual heirs to those masked figures who counted corpses by candlelight. And when Netflix comedians filmed specials from empty living rooms or meme accounts turned lockdown frustrations into cathartic jokes, that's the Jester's legacy alive and well, proving laughter still functions as social glue when the world fractures. Consider how these ancient roles manifest in your daily life. The plague doctor might be the fact-checker debunking misinformation on social media, armed with peer-reviewed studies instead of leeches. The jester could be the co-worker who diffuses tension with a perfectly timed gift during a stressful meeting. Both serve vital functions. One grounds us in reality, the other prevents that reality from crushing us. A study from Johns Hopkins during the COVID pandemic found that hospitals incorporating joy teams, staff who organized everything from puppy therapy visits to stand-up nights, saw a 30% drop in burnout reports among frontline workers. Science measured the benefits, but it took jesters to deliver them. The true medieval wisdom lies in balancing these forces. Imagine public health campaigns during the last pandemic without the grim daily briefings, just raw mortality stats with no humanity. Now picture the opposite, endless memes and no vaccine research. Both scenarios feel hollow because crisis management isn't binary. Venice's health boards knew this instinctively when they paired quarantine enforcement with funded street performers to keep morale afloat. Today's equivalents emerge in clever collaborations, like when the CDC partnered with Twitch streamers to gamify vaccine education, or cities projected comedy clips onto hospital walls to give exhausted staff mental respite. You don't need a pandemic to apply this lesson. Personal crises, job loss, grief, even creative blocks, all demand the same dual approach. The plague doctor in your mind might be the spreadsheet budgeting your savings during unemployment, while the jester is the friend who drags you to karaoke to scream off-key into a microphone. One prevents freefall, the other reminds you that falling isn't fatal. Medieval towns celebrated both the physician who bled buboes and the fool who turned the procedure into a rhyming drinking song because they understood. Survival isn't just about enduring, it's about remembering why endurance matters. So the next time life feels like a crumbling medieval village, take inventory. Who or what plays each role for you? Maybe your plague doctor is a therapist's clinical insights, your jester a comfort rewatch of The Office. Honor both, share both, because history's clearest lesson isn't just that we need science and spirit, it's that they're strongest when they walk the same road, one measuring the wounds, the other teaching us to whistle through them. The beaked masks and motley caps are gone, but their ghosts still walk among us, whispering that resilience wears many costumes. So let's return to that cobbled street, shrouded in mist and memory, where our plague doctor and jester first stood side by side. Only now, their silhouettes mean something more. The doctor's beaked mask isn't just a relic of medieval medicine. It's a testament to our stubborn refusal to surrender without a fight, even when our tools are crude and our understanding thin. The Jester's jingling bells aren't mere frivolity. They're the sound of defiance, a declaration that joy isn't just possible in dark times, it's necessary. Together, they embody humanity's oldest survival strategy: to confront catastrophe with one hand gripping science, the other clutching laughter. Think of the countless crises since their era: wars, pandemics, personal tragedies, and how we still reach for this same dual arsenal. Doctors in hazmat suits and late-night hosts cracking quarantine jokes are just the latest iterations of an eternal dynamic. The plague doctor's legacy lives on in every researcher hunched over a microscope, every nurse holding a dying patient's hand. The Jester's spirit flares in memes that make us snort, laugh through tears, in the friend who sends you a ridiculous gif when your world is falling apart. What these medieval figures teach us isn't just about history, it's about the DNA of resilience. But here's the quiet revelation hidden in their stories: neither role was about victory. Plague doctors lost more patients than they saved. Jesters couldn't cure grief, only briefly outshout it. Their power lay in the trying, in the stubborn act of showing up. That's the real lesson, etched into the wax of those old robes and stitched into the Jester's motley. When the world feels like it's ending, we don't have to choose between sorrow and laughter, between fighting and coping. We must do both. So here's to the masked and the motley, then and now, to the scientists and the clowns, the grim realists and the stubborn optimists. To everyone who's ever faced down despair with a spreadsheet in one hand and a terrible pun in the other, your resilience takes countless forms, and all of them matter. Drop a comment below. What's your modern-day plague doctor or jester moment? When did science or silliness or both pull you through? Because if history whispers one truth, it's this: catastrophe may shape us, but it's how we choose to meet it, with a scalpel or a punchline, that writes the story. And that story isn't